Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the AnthroPuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks, we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we have Katherine Wiley. She graduated from Indiana University with a PhD in anthropology, as well as from Colgate University with a bachelor's in English. As a former tenured professor at Pacific Lutheran University, she recently left academia to start her own editing business, Goldenrod Editorial. As an academic developmental editor, she works with scholars in the qualitative social sciences and humanities, assisting them in meeting and publishing their goals. How are you doing today, Katherine?
I'm good, Abby. How are you?
I am doing great. So what exactly is an academic developmental editor?
Yeah, a lot of people have not heard of us, so I'm happy to spread the word. So we work with faculty and as developmental editors, and I should say developmental editors are concentrated in academia. Developmental editors can also work in fiction and nonfiction more broadly, but developmental editors help people think through bigger picture issues related to their books. So things like argument, structure, voice, organization, and narrative flow. So we typically work with authors at an earlier stage of a manuscript while they're trying to really figure out what their book is really saying, what they want their book to be. And we help them produce the best books that they possibly can.
Okay. So why are academic developmental editors important? Do you work mostly, assuming by the title, you work with a lot of academics? So are books that you're helping them publish, is it like academic books or books for the general public or both?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a range. And yes, so I pretty much exclusively work with faculty. And so that could be everything from books they're writing to journal manuscripts to grant proposals to job letters. So it's a real range. So we're important for a few reasons. One, we help support faculty. And a lot of times faculty don't have a lot of support at their own institutions to help with their writing. This might be surprising, but you probably know, having hosted this podcast, in graduate school, you're often not taught how to write. That's not really part of our training, but faculty have to write as part of their jobs and to keep their jobs. So it can be a really high stress thing for people. So we help support their work and help them ensure that their work can get published and that they can produce high quality work. Some of what we do used to be done by academic publishers themselves. So authors would work with a publisher to press when they were publishing their book, and that person would give them a lot of in-depth feedback about the manuscript and help them make it better. But most university presses budgets have been shrinking over past at least decade. And so they generally are not able to provide the same kind of feedback they could before. So we're also kind of filling a gap in the publishing process. But then I also think academic editors and developmental editors are really important because, as you probably know from having studied anthropology, a lot of faculty cannot write well, and they produce a lot of journal articles and books that are almost unreadable, except by a small group of other experts. And so I remember as a student reading stuff and just being like, I don't know what this person is saying. It made me feel stupid. But I think in reality, it's often that people aren't trained in writing and they don't know how to reach a broader audience. So a lot of the faculty who come to me say, I want my book to be able to be taught and understood, or I want my book to be able to be read by policy experts, or even sometimes like segments of the general public. So a lot of what we do is also helping people write their books in such a way that it can reach a broader audience. So an example, just to give you an example, and I'll just like tell you quickly what a developmental editing process would look like. A typical developmental edit would mean like reading a manuscript through twice, putting comments in the margins, and then writing a kind of overall memo that summarizes our feedback and identifies areas that we think should be revised in some way, and then also gives like pathways for revision. So an example of this is if someone was working on a book on the Ottoman Empire, and if they were wanting to reach a broader audience, they probably need to like right at the start say like what was the Ottoman Empire, and give some kind of broad, sweeping description of it. Of course, if they're writing just for experts, they don't need to do that. So I do a lot of saying, like, explain what this is, or what do you mean by this? Or can you restate that more clearly to help? So I'm always thinking about undergraduates when I read, as well as just people outside of that person's area of specialization in academia. So my hope, and one of the reasons I like this job, is I think faculty are doing awesome research like all over the country, right? But if their research can't be read broadly, its impact is limited, right? So I hope that as editors, we help faculty expand the impact of their research and what it can do in the world.
Yeah, and I totally understand where you're coming from as well, because when I was an undergraduate, there were times when professors would assign readings and I'd be reading through this. I'm like, I have no idea what they're talking about. Or even just reading my husband's thesis or my friend's thesis, I'm like, there's so much academic jargon in here. I really can't follow what you guys are talking about. I mean, it looks good, but I have no idea what you're talking about. So I had actually had a guest on. Her name was Savannah Mendel. She had recently published a book and she wrote it for the general public because she's like, I want people to understand what I'm talking about when it comes to space and the ethics of it. And we actually had a discussion like, should academics have publishers? Like, would this benefit them? So I definitely understand where you're coming from and why this job is super important in getting people to understand kind of like what your research is. Because I mean, I do that in my podcast interviews, is when someone says like ethnography or methods, I'm like, can you define what you mean by that? Because even though my podcast is going to anthropology students and they'll probably know what that is, it's also being listened to by some of the general public who might not know what that is. So what's the difference between developmental editing and like other types of editing, like copywriting, proofreading, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, good question. And I have to say, I didn't totally understand these distinctions when I started investigating becoming an editor. But yeah, there are lots of different kinds of editing. And so as developmental editors, we think about big picture stuff of the work. So we're helping authors figure out what their arguments are and how the book should be structured, and kind of really helping them figure out what the book is. Once that's more in place, the next stage of editor someone might work with, and many people just work with one of these editors, so it's not like you have to progress in this order, but some people do work with all four of these people. The next step is a line editor, and that's something I actually also do. Line editing, a lot of developmental editors do both of these kinds of editing. That's more working in the text itself, and so our argument would be pretty set and the structure of the book, but you might be moving around paragraphs to help make the author's point clearer. You might be drafting like transition sentences to help with flow. So you're kind of cleaning up the text to make sure that it best supports the author's arguments. The next stage, and this is usually right before publishing, is copy editing. That is more focused on mechanical stuff and grammar. So where the commas go, how sentences are structured, and so on. A lot of times for faculty, presses pay for copy editing for their journal articles and books. Not always, but sometimes, say someone who English isn't their first language, if they're publishing in English, they might hire a copy editor themselves before they submit a work, just to make sure everything's cleaned up. And then the last level is proofreaders, and that's right before publication. And they're basically taking like the manuscript from the publisher as it's going to be published and checking it with the copy edits to make sure all of those have been done, looking for any last mistakes in the typesetting so that the book is as like close to perfect in that way as it can be. But sometimes we also work very late in the process. So you probably know, but when faculty submit books, book manuscripts to university presses, it goes through this review process where they send the book out to other faculty members who read it and decide, say if they think it should be published, and then give feedback. And so sometimes that's pretty late in the process, but sometimes if people get feedback that they don't know how to implement, they might bring in a developmental editor at that stage to help them figure out what to do. But yeah, there are lots of different editors and that kinds of editors. And I think that's exciting because if any of your listeners are thinking like, oh, wow, I like working with texts and words, they can also think about what kind of editing might be best suited for them. And for me, I have always hated grammar and not been good at grammar. And it's hard for me. I like, it's always been hard. So I knew like if I want to be a copy editor, I would need to do a lot of training and it's not really my strength. When I think I've always liked thinking about text globally and how the argument works and stuff like that. So I was better suited to be a developmental editor, but I certainly have lots of editing friends who really like copy editing. And so there's a lot of different possibilities, different kinds of editors that people can be if they're interested in pursuing this area.
Right. And I'm not great at grammar either. I think that was one of the classes that I hated working on the most was writing for business because the professor is like, expect to get like 30s and 40s on these quizzes. And I'm like, what? I don't fail at nothing. So this is not what I want to do. But like, I'll help my husband. He'll be like, can you read through this and see if this makes sense? Because my grammar, even though it is horrible, it is better than his. So I'll read through his papers sometimes and be like, okay, this needs to fix. You need to move these around so it makes better sense. So what kind of qualities do you think are essential to have effective academic writing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll just name a couple that I think people don't think of because I think some are kind of obvious. Like you need to be able to state a good argument, right? And have evidence to support that argument. That's kind of the basis, right? But kind of going back to what we were talking about before, I feel like to be a really effective academic writer, it's helpful if you can be a good storyteller and think of your writing as storytelling, not just presenting data, because that's what can draw a reader in. That's what can make the work feel interesting. That's what can convey the importance and meaning of the work. And I guess I'm saying this especially because we're talking mostly to anthropologists, right? And I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, I should say that. So I'm thinking of folks who are doing like participant observation, right? Spending time in their research with people, like watching their lives as they unfold, asking questions as they're happening, taking intense notes, right? You learn a lot of fascinating stories like through your research, right? And watch people's life trajectories and so on. So I'm often encouraging my authors not to start a chapter with something like, my argument in this chapter is blah, 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 blah. But rather, can you share like something that happened during your research that ended up being really important to your understanding of gender or whatever it is you're writing about and kind of draw the reader in through that story. So I think, and again, academics were not taught to write in graduate school generally, so that's not easy to do, which is one of the reasons people work with editors. But I think that can be a great element of being an effective academic writer. And I don't know about you, but when I think of some of my favorite ethnographies, which I'll define it, right, are like books, right, written by anthropologists, usually looking like in depth at a particular aspect of culture or a particular community. A lot of those tell stories, right? One is by Seth Holmes. It's called Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies. I think it's a good example of a well-written anthropology book, which looks at farm workers in Washington state, undocumented farm workers and their health and so on. But he tells a lot of stories about their lives and makes them feel real to the reader. And I think another effective part of academic writing, which also often gets overlooked, is writing clearly and understandably and not assuming that your reader knows the jargon. Because even if they are in your field, that doesn't necessarily know that they mean that they know what like subjectivity means or how you're using it, right? So I try to also make arguments to my authors who resist defining jargon that like it's important to define it so that even the people close to you, the other researchers, know how you're using it in this instance, right? And then, of course, it's also important for all the students reading it or whoever else is reading your book. So I think those are two qualities that if we saw more of them, academic work would get more attention and be more widely read. And I also think one thing that's exciting right now is I do think a lot of faculty agree with that and are working to make their work more accessible. I think the kind of critiques of higher ed kind of more broadly in the broader public discourse and people saying stuff like faculty don't do anything or like their work's not meaning, that kind not, they're not exactly saying that, but that's the implication, has also driven people to want to publish work that's more accessible and better highlights the importance of research.
And do you feel that with your anthropological background that it has helped you as an editor? Because you touched a little bit upon it earlier.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've thought about this because I think it's not exactly a logical career jump, right? As an anthropologist, right? But yeah, I think it definitely has. And I think partly it's kind of what I was saying earlier as an ethnographer, as somebody who like did work doing like living with people and learning about their lives as they unfolded, you're trained to pay attention to stories and to detail and to thinking about how narratives unfold and people's lives unfold. And I think that has translated into helping people do that in their books. I also think, I guess maybe I should have mentioned this earlier. Besides being an editor, I'm a business owner. So I freelancer, I work for myself. I have this editing company that's just me, Goldenrod Editorial. And so some of my work, most of my work is editing, but other work is running a business, right? And knowing how to do that. And anthropology has actually helped a lot with that. And I'll give you an example. A lot of what I do as a business owner is meeting with potential clients, right? And for me, that often entails like listening really carefully to what they say they want, trying to help them figure out what they want, and then being able to articulate back to them like what I can offer and whether I can meet those needs. And as an anthropologist, I think you're just really taught to be a good listener, to be attuned to others, and to focus on others. And so for your listeners, they may not be interested in becoming an editor. But if you're at all thinking of like being a business owner, I actually think anthropology gives you skills that can really help in that way, and being client oriented and being attuned to detail and to client needs. And that's something I didn't think about at all until I started. And then I was like, I think anthropology is like helping with this. So that's been a bonus.
Yeah. So with being an editor, I don't know if things changed a lot, like in the academic publishing sphere, but how do you stay up to date on like current trends or standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one thing about editing, I'll just say this for people, if anyone is like thinking about it, that's kind of interesting, especially for developmental editing, is there's no like set standard. It's not like there's some board of developmental editors and you have to like get certified by them to be a developmental editor. So that's interesting. And in a way, it gives you a lot of leeway and like how you work. But I'd say for people who are thinking of working with a developmental editor, be sure that you know how that person works, like ask them questions about their process and how they understand editing and so on, because it varies a lot. But in terms of staying up, with academic publishing and so on, I read some publications like the Chronicle of Higher Education, for example, has articles about this. But also editors are generally, I found academic editors very friendly and kind and open. So I've developed networks of editors who I meet with occasionally, and we talk about these things and help each other stay up on trends and so on. And then I'm also a member of 2 professional organizations for editors, most of whom are freelance, but not only. There are also lots of editing jobs like at organizations, corporations, for the government and so on, as well as, of course, presses. So I'll just mention those for people who are interested. One is called ACES. And the one I'm more involved in, it's called the EFA, the Editorial Freelancers Association. And they actually have an academic editing chapter that's very active and also free to be part of. You don't have to be a member of the broader organization. So if anyone's interested in academic editing, check that out. But they have lots of webinars, discussion groups, all kinds of things that help you stay up to date on trends in editing. And both of those groups also have conferences. So I've gone to a couple virtual, like online conferences, which is nice to connect with other editors and just get some more training and so on. So I'd say most editors I know are active in organizations like this and then trying to stay updated and continue to develop our skills and so on.
Do you ever kind of take courses to better hone your writing skills or your editing skills?
Yeah, definitely. So when I made this transition, I took, there are different universities that offer certificate programs in editing. So University of Washington does, Chicago does, bunch of them. And it's like 5 courses that you can do over the course of a year or so on. Since I knew I wanted to focus on developmental editing, I took a developmental editing course at the University of Chicago, as well as another online course. And then, the organizations like the EFA I mentioned, they constantly have courses you can do to continue honing skills. So for example, if I decided to move to developmental editing fiction, I would definitely take courses in that before making that leap. So, and it's nice too. A lot of the courses are pretty affordable. I think my Chicago course was $1,000, which isn't cheap, but it's like way cheaper than graduate school or whatever. So it's a nice thing in that you can get some training for not a ton of money. And I think that matters to clients, for sure.
So how did you get into this career path like that got you into being an editor?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you like the quick rundown and then I'm going to talk in depth about one of the things. Yeah, I'll just say I'm 46 and I've done like a lot of different jobs since graduating from college. So I was an English major in college, as you said. So I thought I wanted to be a reporter. So right out of college, I worked as a reporter for a while. And then I decided I was interested in living abroad again. And so I did the Peace Corps, and I'm going to come back. That's the one I'm going to talk about a little bit more, but I'll give you like the whole rundown first. Then I got back from the Peace Corps and I was like, I think I want to work in nonprofits. So I spent several years in Seattle working in different kinds of healthcare related nonprofits. And I did all sorts of jobs for them. I was a volunteer coordinator. I was a newsletter manager. I was a program manager, like coordinating their programs. I helped coordinate conferences. Like I did all sorts of stuff. And then I missed living abroad and learning about other cultures. So that's when I was like, I think I want to do anthropology. And I ended up enrolling in a PhD program at Indiana University. But before that, I was lucky enough to get a fellowship from the Rotary Foundation. And they have fellowships that send people abroad to take courses. So I took courses in Tanzania and East Africa on African studies for a year, which was super awesome. And then I came back and did my PhD. That took about 6 years, including 1 year back in Mauritania doing in-depth like fieldwork, anthropological research. And then I thought I wanted to be a faculty member. So I got a postdoc for a year, which is a kind of interim position that gives you a lot of time to write. And so that was at the University of Virginia. And I worked a lot on my book. And then I was a faculty member out at a small liberal arts school in Tacoma, Washington, Pacific Lutheran University. And I was there for 7 years and published my book and did all the faculty stuff. And then I got tenure and they started a lot of schools are having like financial problems now. And at that time they were laying off faculty. And I was honestly like not happy being a faculty member. So I decided to take a buyout and like leave. And I didn't really know what I was going to do, but ultimately ended up with starting this business. But I just want to go back and talk about the Peace Corps because I think in my trajectory and the reason I like to share that is because I think sometimes like your undergraduate listeners or people who recently graduated might feel like I need to find my career, like my lifelong career. And I think I'm an example of somebody who tried lots of different things. And so I like to say, like when I was teaching, I would say to students, try to think about like what you want to do next and like let go of some of that like long-term pressure, because there are some people who know what they want their career to be and they just go and do it. But I think for a lot of us, it's like much more circuitous and windy, but you still can end up in good places. And all of those experiences like added to my skill set and understanding of the world always benefited me. But I think a Peace Corps is something I just want to talk about because I think some of your listeners might really be into this and it's a great match for anthropology undergraduates. So the Peace Corps is a U.S. government organization that sends volunteers abroad for about 27 months to countries that request those volunteers. So countries identify some need they have that they think Peace Corps volunteers could fill. And so today you actually apply for a job. So it might be like being an agricultural worker in Senegal or teaching English in Nepal. I taught English in Mauritania. That's what I ended up doing in high school. And they send you for 27 months. The first 3 months are intense training. So language training and job training and also like health training, how to take care of yourself. And then you go and you do your job. And it's just as an anthropologist, like if you're somebody who loves learning about other cultures or being immersed in a world that's different from the one you came from, you kind of can't go further in that than Peace Corps because, you know, you really are, you learn the language, you learn a lot about culture, you connect with, make all these lifelong friends with people from other parts of the world. But then another great thing about Peace Corps is you do also learn a lot of skills. And as I said, they do a lot of intense job training and you're encouraged to like work in other areas as well. So when I came back, not only had I taught English and learned a lot about teaching, but I coordinated conferences. I had applied for grants. I facilitated trainings and so on. So if you're somebody who's kind of like in between things and not sure what you want to do, this can be a great way to experience another culture deeply, help out, and build your skill set. And Peace Corps, you're a volunteer, but you're not paying to do it. They pay you while you're there, a small amount, but like enough to get by and wherever you're living. They also give you some money when you come back to help you transition back into being in the States. And I don't know the details of this, but I know you can at least defer some college loans while you're there. So if you have college loans, that doesn't necessarily have to be a deterrent to doing something like this. So anyway, that's the thing that I think most shape how I see the world and who I am. And so anyway, any listeners who are thinking about Peace Corps, definitely check that out because it's a really wonderful opportunity. And I think anthropologists are great candidates because you've already thought deeply about difference in other cultures and so on.
Exactly. I had a friend who considered Peace Corps, but then she ended up getting a job in the States. And I know it's a lot harder to do that, especially if you have kids or a spouse or pets being away for so long. So definitely it's a good thing to do if you are currently single.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. They will also, it's a little harder to get in, but they do place couples together. And I don't think you have to be married anymore. I think you have to have like been together for a certain amount of time because they're trying to avoid like breakups, right? But yeah, I don't think you can bring kids with you in the Peace Corps, but it is something people do. Like we had folks who are retired doing it when I was doing it. So it's something to keep in the back of your mind. Like there may be a moment in life where, yeah, you can like walk away for 2 years or so on. But yeah.
Right. So getting back to your editorial business, is there a memorable success story from your work with an author or manuscript that you would like to share?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's always exciting when books get published that you work on, like holding them in your hands is really exciting. But I have one client I worked with, and I'm just like proud of what they've done. So this person, most of the people I work with are faculty members, and they're paying me with like their research budget, so money that their school gives them to help with research, and they're supported through their institution. But I recently worked with a client who realized like that they were going to be leaving academia, that they didn't get the kind of faculty position they wanted. So they were going through a transition to something else, but they still really wanted their book published, like from their dissertation research. And that's hard, right? It's hard when you don't have like support of an institution to do something like this. So this person hired me to read the manuscript, but also then to meet with them periodically to kind of help keep them on track, just help provide accountability and motivation. And they recently, submitted the manuscript to the publisher. Everything's gone really well. They have a contract and it should be coming out in a year. And I'm just proud of that because I was happy it's a great book. It should be published. But I was also happy to support somebody who didn't have the same kind of support most of my clients have. And I think that's something I'm proud of, that we can provide that kind of help when people need it, when they might not be able to find it in other places. So anyway, I'm going to be really excited to hold that book in my hand next summer, I think, probably. So yeah.
Awesome. And what was your grad school experience like? Do you have any advice for individuals who are maybe looking to go to grad school?
Yeah, I had a great time in grad school. I chose Indiana University because they have a strong program in African studies, and I was interested in doing my research back in Mauritania. So I had great support there, a wonderful committee who are the people who help kind of guide you through your program and through your dissertation. But yeah, I have 2 big pieces of advice, I would say. First, everyone who's thinking of going to grad school, who is thinking of doing it because they want to be like a faculty member. So a lot of people who are thinking of PhDs, that's what they want to do, right, is teach. Know that the job market is really competitive and it's really hard to land faculty positions these days. Many positions get over 100 or sometimes even 200 applicants for one position. So it's like rough out there. So that doesn't mean people don't do it. Like, yes, there are anthropologists hired every year to teach at universities, but it's tough. So first thing I say to folks is like, if that's what you want to do, if your dream is to be a faculty member, I would recommend not going maybe to a PhD program unless it's fully funded. So like some PhD programs will basically pay for you to go get your PhD. Not a lot, like you're not going to be rich, but enough to support your cost of living and so on and pay for your tuition. And if you do that and then you get out and you can't get a faculty position, at least you're like, oh, well, I'm not in $100,000 of debt or however much it might be. So really, really think about that. And then the second piece of advice is related, and I wish I had done this in graduate school, is since it's hard to get faculty positions, be aware of that and maybe approach your PhD studies strategically. Like, I wish I had thought more about getting skills that would have helped me get jobs outside of academia. So an example of that is my committee, the people who helped me out, were very qualitatively focused. And I wish I had taken a couple courses in statistics and learned more about quantitative research analysis, because a lot of corporations and businesses and so on need quantitative researchers right now. So just think about like the kinds of getting some skills that transfer well outside of academia. They might help you in academia too, but don't just like limit yourself to thinking all you're going to be as a faculty member, because it's very possible that might not pan out in the way that you hope it will.
Right. With being an academic developmental editor, and you said you work for yourself because you have your own business, what does the average salary look like for a position like that?
So just a couple things on that. The Editorial Freelancers Association, EFA, which I mentioned earlier, they publish a rate sheet every year, which gives you a sense of like what editors make and charge. Some editors charge hourly. That's what I do. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it gives you a sense of like those different kind of editors and academic editors and people who edit in other areas, what they're charging. So you can then like do the math out from there of how much people might make. I would say keep in mind with that, if you're like for the hourly rate, it's hard to bill more than 4 to 5 hours a day of editing because it's just such intense intellectual work. So anyway, it's not like you can just say, oh, I work 40 hours a week and that means it's this much. Just to give you a sense, for me, when I started my business 3 years ago, I was charging $60 an hour. Now I'm up to $85 an hour because I realized like of my skill level and whatever. And so but I also am a mom of a 6-year-old. And so one of the reasons I wanted to start this business was I wanted more flexibility. So I am with him like 4 days a week after school, which means my work days are kind of from like 7:30 to 2:30 with an hour lunch. So they're kind of limited. So I just checked because I knew you were going to ask me this question. I think I'm probably going to make about $70,000 this year. So working 3/5 time, right? So you can like add out. I'll say that the other thing to know is if you're owning a business like I am, that's actually more than I was making as a faculty member, not counting like my benefits package. So I have to save for my own retirement as a business owner. I have to pay like business taxes and stuff. So you need to, like, if someone's trying to decide, can I make a living on that? You need to like factor that into your figuring. But I think you're not going to get like super rich being an editor unless you open like an agency where you're hiring other editors to work for you. But I think a lot of people make like a totally decent living doing this and enjoy the flexibility that owning your own businesses gives them.
And I had looked up some figures just to kind of get a range. And according to Glassdoor, the average in the United States is like 60 to 100,000 a year, which honestly, depending on where you live, that's not too bad.
Right. Yeah, right. Definitely. Yeah. And I think one thing to just know if people are thinking about editing, and you'll see this on that rate sheet, like copy editors generally can charge less than developmental editors. And so you want to be like making some decisions accordingly. But yeah, I know a lot of people who are definitely making like a living doing this and like living totally decent lifestyles.
Yeah. And it's cool that they have published kind of like a rate sheet for that, because I know a lot of individuals who start their own businesses where it's like, whether it's photography or art or whatnot, they don't know what to charge people because they're like, well, I don't want to overcharge someone and then I get no business, but I don't want to undercharge as well. So that's cool that they provide something like a resource like that.
Yeah, it really helps you as you're getting started, figure out like what's reasonable.
Yeah. So is there anything we haven't discussed today that you would like the listeners to know about?
I don't think so. I feel like we've covered the kinds of things I was hoping to talk about. So thanks, Abby.
Of course. So our final 4 questions I ask everyone. What's the best piece of advice you'd offer to someone who's interested in getting into academic developmental editing?
Yeah, so if you're interested in getting into this, I would say try to get some practice. That's one thing I did when I was starting out. I reached out to colleagues or friends who were faculty members and did a little, I'm not saying you should do a lot of this, but like free work for them to try to figure out if I liked it, how fast I was, if I seemed suited for it. So I think that's a good thing to do if you're really early on and just sort of trying to figure it out. I would also say networking has been really helpful for me. As I said before, editors seem to be very friendly and open. And I've ended up getting a lot of business from other editors I'm friends with. We refer clients to each other if we're too busy to take on work that somebody asks us to do. So a great way to get started with that and to feel out if academic editing is interesting for you is to get involved with that academic editors chapter of the at the Editorial Freelancers Association. And they have a monthly kind of like chat group where we all meet via Zoom and talk about a topic. They have workshops and webinars and a book group and all kinds of things. So just starting to go to some of those activities, you would start to connect with editors. And actually, I just thought of this. They also started a webpage, which is called Editing After Academia, where they have a list of editors who are willing to talk, especially with faculty who are transitioning to being editors. But my guess, most of them would be willing to talk to like other people who are interested in becoming academic editors. So do some informational interviewing with editors. And I'm always happy to talk to people. So feel free to reach out to me as well if you listeners would like to learn more.
Awesome. And what changes do you wish to see within your industry?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I guess two things. One, I'd like more people to know about academic developmental editors. This is still a fairly new thing. I published my book in 2018 and I didn't hear about academic editors until like after it was out. And I remember being like, what? Like developmental editing is a thing and I could have gotten someone to help make my book better? Like, what the heck? So anyway, I hope that like the word keeps getting out because I think, as I said earlier, a lot of faculty don't have a lot of support with their writing and are kind of, I especially try to work with women and people of color, people who might be kind of marginalized in academia and not have as much support in place in their departments and so on. And so anyway, I hope people hear more about academic editing. And then, but anyway, that's definitely one of them. Oh, and the other thing I'd like to see is that I think people feel, and this can definitely be true, that working with an editor is very expensive. So a lot of people just start like off the bat are like, I can't do that. I can't afford that. I don't have a big research budget. And it can be expensive to work with an editor. Just to give you a sense, for me to do like a full in-depth developmental edit of a book manuscript is probably like $4,000 to $5,000. But editors can also work with smaller budgets. So if you're someone who like wants to work with an editor, but only has $500 or whatever, I would urge you to still reach out to an editor and see what they can do for you, because often we can do kind of high impact work, maybe just work on one chapter or have a series of meetings where we talk through the book with you or whatever. So I think another thing I'd like to see change is just that sense that like academic editing is only for people at big fancy institutions. But rather, I think we can help people in all different budget ranges. And that's good for them and books as well.
And so you've mentioned a couple times that you have published a book. What was your book about?
Oh, good question. Thanks. Yeah. So it's an academic book, but I tried to write it in an accessible way, Abby. But it was, so my research was in Mauritania, where I did the Peace Corps. And in Mauritania, Mauritania was the last country to legally abolish slavery. So slavery was abolished in 1980 in Mauritania. Yeah. So I was interested, given that recent kind of history with slavery, I was interested in how women in Mauritania who were either former slaves or descendants of slaves, most descendants of slaves by the time I was doing my research, how they were building meaningful lives for themselves in the country. Former slaves are physically marked as being slaves because they are generally of Black African descent and they speak this dialect of Arabic. And most of the slave owners are of Arab descent, and they also speak that dialect. And so anyway, like people know people's histories. So I was interested in how are they building meaningful lives, and especially how are they using economic activities to do that. So I looked at like women's work in markets, women giving gifts at weddings, women dyeing veils, and so on. And so it's a lot of fun, and I learned a lot through the research process. And now, of course, I can see like, oh, also writing the book and going through the publishing process has helped me a lot in the work I do now with other faculty.
Do you ever kind of go back and reread it as like a developmental editor be like, oh, I should have made this changes, or I'm going to make a new version and edit this so it's better.
I have a hard time like reading it again, which is maybe weird. But I have gone back, and sometimes you're pleasantly surprised, right? I was like, oh, my argument is early in the book, and it's clear. That made me happy. But I do think with my editorialize now, if I could rewrite it, I would want to make it even more narrative in nature, as I was saying before, have more of a story, and maybe even try to publish it. And I would have had to do a ton of work to do this, but outside of a university press, right? So the stories could have gotten out more broadly. Maybe someday I'll like rewrite it.
So what do you just absolutely love about your job and the work you do?
Yeah, so I love deeply engaging with ideas every day. I find that really exciting and stimulating, and I'm just always learning about new things, which is helpful. And I also really love supporting writers. That's something I hadn't thought about as much when I started, but a lot of people feel very anxious and stressed, and I like being on their team to help them feel more confident about their work. I also love being a small business owner. And like no one in my family is an entrepreneur. Nobody in my family owns businesses or ever has. I think it's something I never considered at all until I left academia. And I'm just saying that because you might have listeners out there who are like that and had never thought about owning your own business. But for me, it's been wonderful to be able to be creative in the ways I want, have control over where things are going, not have to go to stupid meetings I hate, not have to work for people who drive me crazy. So that's been really positive. And of course, there are challenges owning your own business. A big one being like, maybe this month's going really well, but you're worried about what your income's going to be like next month or whatever. So there's always some uncertainty, which can be hard. But for me, the positives have way outweighed the negatives. So I'm just saying that if you have listeners out there who might not be interested at all in editing, don't rule out business owning and thinking about like what skills do I have that might translate well into that.
Right. And finally, where can listeners learn more about you and your work?
So I have probably the main place is my company website, which is goldenrodeditorial.com. And I have a lot of information on there about developmental editing. I have some information about my background and how I got there, the kinds of services I offer. I also have a fairly active blog where I write about academic editing, academic life, academic writing. So that would be another place people could go if they were interested in learning more about what developmental editors do and so on. And then I'm also somewhat active on LinkedIn. But yeah, like please connect with me there and don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. I'm happy to talk to listeners, especially, recent anthropology graduates who are trying to figure out what they want to do next. I'm always happy to chat.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on AnthroPuzzled and talking about all this with me.
Thank you, Abby. It was a total pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. And if you ever say you change career paths again or anything like that, I would love to have you come back on and discuss it.
Okay, that well may happen. So I will definitely keep you posted.
Awesome. Well, you have a fantastic rest of your day, Katherine.
All right. Thanks, Abby. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to another episode of AnthroPuzzled. This show was produced by me. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website, Leah Akers for the incredible logo design, and to Fiona, AnthroPuzzled's newest intern, for editing the episode descriptions. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound and Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letsinger@anthropuzzled.com or as AnthroPuzzled on Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, or YouTube. Until next time.